welcome back. Joining us today is Dr. Rian Sutton, who, just like reruns of the Jersey Shore, never get old.
Hey, those people are state heroes.
So today you're going to tell us about why the theorists that we've talked about already are putzes, right?
Okay, maybe not putzes, but definitely not taking in the full picture. When we look at criminological theories, they present themselves as general theories, theories that explain offending by all people. But if you analyze them, they take men as the default. So they're actually theories about why men commit crime. If we want to look at why women commit crime, we need to turn to feminist criminology.
All right, hold up. What do you exactly mean by feminist here?
Okay, fair enough. There are some terms we need to define before carrying on with this discussion. Feminism is a socio-political movement that advocates for the economic, social, and political equality between men and women. And they say that to achieve this, we need to dismantle the patriarchy. Patriarchy is a social structure in which men have more power than women, and as a result, their needs and desires are prioritized, and women are considered second class in that system. When we're talking about men and women, it's important to note that we're talking about gender rather than sex. So sex is biological. It's what you're born with. You're either male or female. However, gender is something that is socially constructed. So you might be born female, but the way you perform your femininity and the way you are judged for that performance is going to be based on how society defines femininity and womanhood.
Okay, I get that. But what exactly is feminist criminology then, and why do we even need it?
Fair question. So feminist criminology studies women as victims and offenders in a patriarchal society. And it looks at how the social construction of gender affects the way women are treated in the criminal justice system. Feminist criminologists argue that before they came along, theories about crime either ignored women completely or treated them as marginal or inferior.
All right, when did feminist criminologists come along then?
To answer that question, we need to talk about the historical context of the feminist movement. And I think it's important to note that when we talk about the feminist movement, we usually talk about it in waves. And this is a very important visual, because even though we put certain years around these waves, they're not separate movements. It's all one movement. And the idea is that new theories come up, there's campaigns and hopefully some reform and some change, and then that dips back down and pushes the next movement on. So it's one continuous movement, but it's easier to understand if we break it up into sections.
Okay, so folks are surfing for a while, right?
Yes.
But we do have the initial surfers catching that first wave. And who are these people, and what are they arguing in the first instance?
So this first wave happens in the 19th and early 20th century, and these are feminists and women's rights activists who are saying that there needs to be political and legal equality between men and women. The sort of things they're looking at are married women's right to own property, because in the 19th century, for a lot of it, they didn't have that right. Access to education, so being able to go to university, get certain jobs like a doctor or a lawyer, the right to sit on a jury, the right to hold political office, the right to file for divorce. All these sorts of things are things that feminists at the time are saying women should have the right to do. The main push in this period is that they want women to get the right to vote, because it's their argument that if women are given the right to vote, then they can enact real change. They don't need to convince men to vote a certain way, they can just vote that way themselves. And this is where we get the term the suffrage movement, suffragists, suffragettes.
And here in South Australia, this was one of the first places in the world that we saw women obtain the right to vote, right?
Yes. White women primarily. And this is something that's really important, especially about first wave feminism, is that it is a white woman's movement and mainly a middle class white woman's movement. So South Australia gives women the right to vote in 1892, and it does grant that right to Aboriginal women in 1894. However, it kind of forgot to tell them that they had that right. And when they found out and tried to vote, a lot of times they were actively discouraged. Now, when Australia unifies in 1902, Aboriginal people are not allowed to vote in federal elections, and they don't get the right to vote back until 1962.
That's several decades later. So you're telling us that these feminist ideas are coming up at the turn of the 20th century, but I don't remember a whole lot of feminist theories being talked about at the same period. Am I wrong?
No, criminological theories at this time are either ignoring women or they are deeply misogynistic. Frances Heidenstone, who is one of the foundational feminist criminologists of the 1960s and 1970s, attributes the silence around female offenders to the emergence of sociological criminology. So we talked about that last week with Durkheim and Merton. And their argument is that crime is a normal part of society. It's just something that happens. And Heidenstone says that, well, that's not true for women, because statistically, women commit far less crime than men, and also it goes against their gender roles. Crime is something men do, not something that women do. So it doesn't actually match the theories that Durkheim and Merton came up with, and she argues that because it didn't match, they basically just ignored them.
Yeah, okay. But what about those theories that we've talked about that do address women, right? We talked about Cesare Lombroso, and he had some peculiar views about women. Care to refresh us?
Oh yes, our good friend Cesare Lombroso. What a gem. So he's developing his ideas in the 1870s and his ideas about women in the 1890s. And he argues that women are less evolved than men, so less evolved that they don't even have room to degenerate to the point of being criminals. And that usually when women express their degeneracy, they do it through sexual immorality. However, the few that do actually degenerate to the point of being criminals are true monsters. They are double exceptions. They're worse than male criminals. In general, in this period, theories that explained women's crime pathologized that crime and said that women's crime stemmed from the fact that they were constantly on the verge of being excessively emotional or going a bit insane.
And these are themes that we still hear today, right?
Absolutely. Our conceptualizations of women, and especially female offenders, hasn't really changed all that much, especially around these ideas of mental instability. In the 19th century, a lot of these ideas are tied to women's biology, particularly in terms of their reproductive function. So it's an idea that around PMS, or when you're menstruating, or if you're pregnant, or if you're breastfeeding, or if you've recently given birth, or if you're menopausal, you are at a heightened point of possibly going a bit insane.
So in other words, if you're a woman and you're alive, you might be crazy.
Pretty much, yeah. And this is really convenient at this time when women are campaigning for the right to vote, because they can argue, you're not rational, you can't be trusted to make good choices, don't worry, we'll do it for you. And it really delays women being granted the right to vote.
And so that's a great example of the patriarchy, with men establishing their dominance in a system and creating a narrative which ensures that their power goes unchallenged, right?
Absolutely.
So considering criminological thought at the time, basically there were two lines of thinking, right? One was, let's ignore women because we don't really care about them, or they're crazy double deviants.
Exactly. And this is what second wave feminism begins to respond to. So second wave feminism begins in the 1960s and goes until around the mid-1990s. And they're building on the gains of first wave feminism, but also some of the disappointments of first wave feminism, right? Because there was the idea that if women got the vote, they could enact real change. Now we're in the 1960s and not as much has been done as feminists would like. So they're saying we need to do more than just have the vote. So they are looking at broader social inequalities, including women's experiences in the home, in public spaces, in the workplace, and access to reproductive rights like contraception and the right for abortion. Feminist activists at this time are also drawing attention to experiences of domestic violence and sexual violence, which weren't necessarily ignored in first wave feminism, but weren't given the same degree of attention as they get in second wave feminism.
So in other words, they're shining lights on parts of society that are previously ignored with a lot of the criminological thought that was focused on street crime, the stuff that's happening in public, the stuff that we get concerned about because it's in our face.
Yes, so they start to look at things that are behind closed doors and eventually reveal that women are at a much higher risk of victimization in their home than they are on the street, which is a pretty disturbing thought. Essentially, what second wave feminism is doing is they're focused on critiquing the patriarchy and critiquing male-dominated institutions. And criminology and the criminal justice system are no exception to this. So they start to challenge the silences around female offenders and female victimization, and also challenge the sexist theories that exist at this time.
Challenging the patriarchy. I guess that's smashing the patriarchy. I've seen that on t-shirts, but what does it mean and how do feminist criminologists go about doing it?
Well, one of the first feminist criminologists that starts to try to smash the patriarchy is Carol Smart, and she is an English feminist sociologist. And in 1976, she writes a book called Women, Crime, and Criminology, A Feminist Critique. And in this book, she develops one of the foundational ideas of feminist criminology, which is that women are treated as doubly deviant. So they are judged first for having committed a crime, and second, for how far they've deviated from their expected gender role.
Well, hold up. That kind of sounds like Cesare's idea in terms of defining why women are real bad.
Exactly. So this is taking that idea and showing how this is a form of oppression that women experience.
So, what exactly do you mean by gender roles? I'm not sure if I know what that is.
Well, like we said at the start, gender is something that is socially constructed. It's society telling you how you should perform your gender, how you should behave. And in feminist texts, they talk about appropriate femininity, which is the ideal way women are expected to perform as women. And this includes traits like being respectable, being moral, being chaste, being submissive, and domestic, essentially focusing on being a good wife and a good mother, fulfilling those classic female roles. What double deviance is, and what Smart is saying, is that when men commit a crime, they are judged just for having committed that crime. But when women commit a crime, they're judged for committing that crime, but also for how much they deviate from this ideal of appropriate femininity, either in terms of committing that crime or just in their day-to-day lives. And this will be judged differently for different women, and it will affect the way they are treated by the criminal justice system.
Okay, so how so? Are you saying that women are treated worse by the criminal justice system than men are?
It depends. This idea of double deviance is used to respond to the chivalry thesis, which is a theory developed by Otto Pollack, who is an American sociologist and a grade A misogynist. And he develops the chivalry thesis, and he does this by looking at the statistical difference in offending between men and women, noting that for women it's quite low. And he doesn't trust these numbers. He thinks that women are actually committing far more crime. He believes that women are naturally devious and manipulative, and they can hide their crimes, or they can convince men to commit their crimes for them, and that as a result, these numbers are falsely low. He also argues that women are treated better by the criminal justice system because it's run by men, and men believe that because women are the weaker sex or the fairer sex, they need to be treated gently. They need to be granted chivalry. And so as a result, they get more lenient treatment from the criminal justice system than men do.
So, in other words, he's saying that in the criminal justice system, men are holding the door open for women to get out a little bit sooner.
Basically, yeah.
Well, was there any data to back up his assertions, or is this just stuff that he's spouting off because he had a bad breakup and now he wants to make life difficult for folks?
Well, he's 100% that creepy guy that slides into your DMs and then yells at you for not going out with him. Whether or not he's right about the chivalry thesis is debated among feminists. And the general consensus is that it depends. If you can show conformity with the ideals of appropriate femininity, then you are more likely to be granted lenient treatment by the criminal justice system because you're doing what is expected of a woman. So, for example, let's say you've stolen some money, but you can demonstrate that you're a good wife and a good mother and that you did this to feed your children. Then you'll probably get lenient treatment. If you deviate from these ideals of appropriate femininity, and let's say you've committed the same offense, but it can be shown that you have multiple sexual partners and you leave your kids alone for several hours at night to go to the bars, well, then you're probably going to be treated quite harshly and in a way that is disproportionately harsh to the offense that you've actually committed. Frances Heidensohn, who we've already mentioned, refers to this as double jeopardy, so being judged twice. And Pat Carlin, who is another feminist criminologist, argues that this is judicial misogyny.
All of that double jeopardy stuff doesn't sound good, and certainly where we come from, folks are not supposed to have double jeopardy as a matter of principle, right?
Right.
But some women sound like they're benefiting from this process. Is it not a good thing?
So it's true that this could be beneficial and appealing to individual women on trial. The idea that you can emphasize your femininity and maybe that will help you get more lenient treatment. But feminist criminologists argue that this leniency, if it even exists, is actually very detrimental and bad for women as a category and for society, because what it's doing is reinforcing negative and sexist stereotype. You're rewarding good women and punishing bad women. And in order for women to demonstrate that they're good women, they need to either show that they're a bit crazy and they couldn't control their actions, or that they're victims of society and they were overwhelmed and couldn't handle what they were doing. So it perpetuates this idea of women as weak, defenseless, and irrational.
Okay, so you're talking about what a good woman is, but I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of that applies to being a good white woman. Are we seeing situations where Black and brown women are finding challenges in terms of demonstrating that they are quote unquote good women?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that Black feminists begin to point out during second wave feminism. So it's important to note that second wave feminism, just like first wave feminism, is primarily a white women's movement, and within that, primarily a middle class white women's movement. During second wave feminism in the US, Black women who have been denied leadership positions in the civil rights movement and are also feeling ignored by the mainstream feminist movement start their own campaigns and say, we have unique experiences, unique needs. We are also uniquely positioned to understand oppression in terms of race, gender, and class. And this idea of multiple layers of oppression is something that is synthesized by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a lawyer and professor. And she focuses on something called intersectionality, which is a term she coined in 1989.
Okay, so intersectionality, right? I think of intersections and those are two roads coming together. Is it kind of like that?
Basically, yes. So as an individual, you occupy multiple positions within society. So your race, your class, your sexual orientation, gender, religion, any of those things, they're going to position you in society in certain ways and bring with them certain levels of oppression or possibly advantage. Intersectionality is about how each of those categories that you identify with intersect and overlap and sort of create unique forms of oppression that you experience based on how those intersect in your life. And so Black women, just to simplify it down to two categories, Black women are both Black and women. But as Black women, they experience different forms of oppression than white women or Black men will experience.
So, what does this have to do with the chivalry thesis, and what does this have to do with crime?
Well, that relates back to your question about minority women and the challenges that they face in conforming to these ideas of appropriate femininity. Gender norms are established and defined by the dominant social group, which, as we keep saying, are white middle-class men. So they're going to create these ideals out of their lived experiences and their own values. It'll be easier for people closer to that dominant social group to express these norms and values. So white middle-class women are going to have an easier time conforming to ideals of femininity because it probably matches their lived experiences and their values, at least to some extent.
Yeah, okay. And this is going to be true in Europe, it's going to be true in the United States, it's going to be true in Australia, right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter the specific context of those ideals. It depends on who's defining them, and it's always going to be the dominant social group. So, for example, if being a good mom is one of the ideals of appropriate femininity, this is going to be easier for middle-class women who either can stay at home with their children or can afford the best quality child care. However, women of a lower socioeconomic class are going to have a harder time with this because they're going to have to get jobs. They might not be able to be there with their kids all the time, and they might not be able to afford the highest quality child care. So when it comes to being judged by the criminal justice system, there's a good chance that they'll be judged more harshly.
Okay, so right here you're talking about class and just class, right? So any person who is a middle class person has access to resources that a lower class person doesn't. So it goes to reason that a middle class woman has an easier path to being a good mom because she has the ability to stay at home, as her husband might have good money, or to go to work and provide really good child care to her children. Whereas a woman who is a lower class woman, even of the same ethnicity, race, whatever, is not going to have access to those resources and therefore will have more challenges in terms of defining herself as a quote unquote good mother.
Yes, so it's not about being or not being a good mom. It's about the way that your behavior as a mother is viewed and assessed by the outside.
Okay, so we talked about this intersectionality before. How does that feed into the equation?
If we're going to talk again primarily about Black women, although it's important to point out that intersectionality is not a black-white distinction. There's going to be the same issue with someone of any minority category. But speaking specifically about Black women, they have historically, by the dominant social group, so white middle-class men, been hypersexualized, considered to be more masculine in their appearance and their behavior, and given the fact that they're more likely to be in a lower socioeconomic group, are going to find it harder to portray themselves as good moms. So with this, it's harder for them to demonstrate conformity with these white middle-class ideals of appropriate femininity. And as a result, they're more likely to be viewed as criminal and to be treated harshly by the criminal justice system. This connects to critical race theory, which is another idea that Crenshaw helped found and develop. And this is not about saying that, one race should feel guilty for the way that another race is treated, but it's about pointing out that racism is not about individual prejudices or individual negative attitudes about other races. It's something that is baked into the criminal justice system, and racism is perpetuated by the way the criminal justice system treats minority people. And again, this is not just Black people, this is all minorities. And it's also important that it's not just racial minorities. This is going to be true for anyone whose intersectional identity comes with a certain amount of oppression. So for example, a gay white woman is going to have a harder time demonstrating that she is a good wife and mother than a straight white woman.
So you're telling me Pollock, in all of his infinite wisdom as a Class A misogynist, is actually wrong. Women aren't in the background sneaking around committing better crime than men, and women actually commit far less crime than men, like we've seen historically be the case. Mm-hmm. So what are feminist criminologists doing to explain this?
Well, one of the first attempts to explain this is actually happening during a time when there is a slight uptick in women's offending. So this is in the 70s and the 80s. These are still really small numbers, though, and because these numbers are so small, it's easy for them to seem like they're increasing rapidly. So, for example, if you double 1, that's a big jump to 2, but 2 is still a small number compared to how many crimes are happening. So it could just be changes in policing, changes in how things are reported, and not actually a significant increase in women actually committing crime. However, 2 feminist criminologists try to explain this uptick. So that's Frida Adler and Rita Simon. And they both published books in 1975, but they are completely different books and completely different theories. However, both tie this uptick in crime to the feminist movement and women's increased freedoms as a result of this movement. So Adler says that because women are leaving the home, their role in society is changing, and as a result, women themselves are changing, and they're becoming more aggressive and competitive, basically more masculine. And this is causing them to become more violent and more likely to engage in crime. Simon says that women themselves aren't actually changing. All that's changing is that they have more opportunities to commit crime, especially economic crime and things like white-collar crime, because now they're in the business world, they're in positions of trust. So it's not a change in women, it's a change in opportunity. These ideas were heavily criticized. For example, Carol Smart points out that these changes started happening before feminism really had any kind of power behind it. And also, women's role didn't change that dramatically in this short period. Also, these trends reversed themselves by the mid-90s, so these theories, or emancipation theories as they're referred to, are pretty much discredited at this point.
Yeah, and over all of this, women are still offending far less than men are, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so it's clear that the rise in the feminist movement didn't change offending rates in any sort of significant way. They remain low historically, and that's still true today. Do we know why that's the case?
There's no one clear answer. Feminists have been examining this and trying to figure out why this is the case, and there's a couple different ideas, but no general consensus. So one idea goes to how girls and boys are socialized differently. Girls are encouraged to be risk averse, so not to put themselves in positions of danger, not to take chances, and also not to be violent. Whereas for boys, these actions are not necessarily encouraged, but they're at least accepted. There's an idea that boys will be a bit rough and tumble, they're going to be a bit violent, they're more likely to engage in risky behavior. The whole boys will be boys argument. And this mentality towards boys' behavior is something that's more likely to lead them into crime. Frances Heidenstone has a theory that is related but different. So she says that women experience high levels of informal social control. So it's not outright obvious control, but in day-to-day experiences, in the home, in public, in the workplace, and through social policies, they're encouraged to conform to ideals of femininity. And often they're in situations where men are in positions of power and authority above them. And there's a fear that stepping out of line will cause social stigma, so basically being judged negatively by society, or could result in real violence, either domestic violence or sexual violence. And she argues that to understand women's offending, we need to actually look at the tendency of women to conform rather than the tendency of women to be deviant to understand these low numbers.
So when you're talking about control and access to being able to do things, I remember earlier you were talking about how women weren't able to own property. And I know that there was a long time where women weren't able to have their own bank account if they were married and things like this, right? So was that contributing to the kinds of control mechanisms that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea that women don't have space to make their own choices, they don't have the freedom to be autonomous, basically to be in control of their own decisions, their own actions, follow through with what they want to do.
All right, so even with all of this control and this socialization, some women still commit crime. And this was true even before we started seeing things like sexual liberation in the 1960s and 70s. So what gives?
So once again, there's no one specific answer to this question. However, Pat Carlin, who is an English criminologist, has developed a theory around this. In 1988, she published a book called Women, Crime, and Poverty. And in this book, she interviewed 39 women who were criminal offenders. And she highlighted 4 key factors that contributed to their turn to a life of crime. One was being in residential care, so that's basically being in foster care, in an orphanage, something like that. The second was having a drug or alcohol addiction. Third was just for excitement. They wanted to do it for a bit of fun. And fourth is poverty. And poverty is something that gets talked about a lot in connection with women's crime, both in Carlin's theory and generally. And this is because even though women are represented in every category of criminal offense, they are most represented in economic crimes. So these are the type of crimes they tend to commit the most.
Okay, what do you mean by economic crimes?
So with that, I'm talking about things like theft and fraud, things that help them make ends meet. And this is part of an idea coming out of the US in the 1980s called the feminization of poverty. And what's happening in this period of the 1980s is the wealth gap between the wealthy and the rest of us is widening. And women are more likely to be in positions of a lower socioeconomic status. Also, with changes in society, they're more likely to have dependents and care obligations. So of elderly relatives that people can no longer afford to put in care homes, women are most likely the people caring for them. Also their own children. There's also a rise in single mothers, so they have all of these care obligations and less money. Adding to that, the fact that with these care obligations, it's harder for them to get work, at least full-time steady work. And for those that can get onto the labor market, it's incredibly sexist. They're less likely to get a job than a man. And when they do get a job, they're going to be paid less for that job. So suddenly women have more obligations, less money, and less access to getting this money.
We see a lot of those things persist today. Childcare is still really expensive. Women still get paid less than male counterparts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea is that this pressure can lead to economic crime.
That sounds a lot like string theory, except geared towards women.
Yes, exactly. This is specifically focused on how the social structure disadvantages women and puts pressure on them. And this is a group that Merton basically ignored in his theory. But here, feminist criminology is putting women back into this equation.
All right, but feminist criminology isn't just interested in offenders, right? That would be a little short-sighted, right? I think there's a lot of work that feminist criminologists are doing in order to talk about how women experience crime as victims.
Yes, absolutely. And this is called feminist victimology. And once again, it's a big part of second wave feminism. So in the 1970s, they started to draw attention to women's experience of domestic violence and sexual violence, and specifically framing this as men's violence against women. Even just talking about this was radical, because crime in the home was considered to be something that was private and you shouldn't intrude. This is something between a husband and a wife or two intimate partners, and that's it. No one else should get involved. It's also a source of shame for victims, both domestic violence and sexual violence. They might not be comfortable talking about it. So once again, this contributes to it being a very secretive sort of crime. Added to that was the perception of the time by police that this wasn't real police work. You know, it's not that cool being out on the streets, taking down bad guys sort of thing. But it is a very important form of crime that needs to be policed. On top of this, feminists start to point out that the criminal justice system is actually victimizing these victims. And this is something that they refer to as secondary victimization.
Okay, what do you mean by that? Victims have already been victimized, so how do they get victimized again?
Right, so you're victimized the first time by the offense that's happened to you. Secondary victimization is based on the way the criminal justice system treats you. So the idea that you go to the police to report a crime and they don't believe you, or they're skeptical, or they ask you about your moral character. Things like, why were you out alone at night? Were you drinking? How were you dressed? Did you ask for this? So basically making victims feel like they are responsible for their victimization.
So all of those attributes that you just mentioned kind of sound like the victim blaming stuff that we hear still to this day. And sometimes it seems like when we're listening to stories of folks on TV, we tend to focus on a subset of people. We tend to listen to folks who might be a little bit more wealthy or who come from a specific neighborhood, and we worry about what happens to them a little bit more. Does this go back to that conversation of intersectionality in terms of who we care about?
Yes, and this is something that Hilary Potter, who is a Black feminist criminologist, argues about in an article she published in 2006. And she says that we need to apply critical race theory and intersectionality to our understanding of victims' experiences. And that minority women, this doesn't have to be black and white, this can be any category of minority, is going to experience victimhood differently. And we need to keep that in mind when we're analyzing their experiences, but also coming up with ways to address their experiences of victimization. In general, the concern with the way the criminal justice system victimizes all women, not just minority women, is that it discourages women from reporting their experiences of victimization. And as a result, men are not being punished for the crimes they are committing, and there's a lack of real change because these issues just aren't being addressed to the extent that they should be.
Yeah, and even with the progress that we've made in the past decade or so, I know that sexual assault is still one of the lowest reported crimes out of all crimes.
Absolutely.
So the work that these feminist criminologists started began in the 1970s, and it sounds like that a lot of the issues that they've raised, a lot of the concerns that they were worried about, are still concerns that we see today. What's going on?
That's absolutely true, and it's definitely been a slow build to any real change happening, but hopefully we are seeing some advances. For example, in Australia, they just completed the Royal Commission into Family Violence, so that was completed in 2015, and that highlighted the need for significant changes in how domestic violence is policed and how victims are treated. And we can see some benefits of that already. For example, in 2019, the Victoria Police opened their Centre of Learning for Family Violence, which allows them to simulate experiences of domestic violence, to train police how best to respond in these circumstances, and how to have a trauma-informed response to victims. So it's been a really long road, and it's probably still a very long road even beyond this, but it looks like some good steps are being made in the right direction.
So you're talking about contemporary concerns, and they dip back into the past where you were talking about second wave feminism. What happened to feminism? Did it just die like 90s grunge?
90s grunge has never died. My closet of flannel shirts can prove this. And neither did feminism. So after second wave feminism, there is third and fourth wave feminism. But there's a bit of a shift in this period. So now in third and fourth wave feminism, there's an interest in gender more broadly, not just in terms of how it connects to women, and also there's an interest in different forms of oppression, not just oppression based on gender.
Okay, so you're telling me that these third wave feminists aren't just focusing on women anymore?
They are still focusing on women, but it has expanded, basically. So third wave feminism starts in the mid-90s and goes to 2010s. And they are now more committed to the idea of intersectionality. They want to shake off this stigma of first and second wave feminism as being just a white middle-class women's movement. They are interested in various experiences of oppression of both white and minority women and other sorts of oppression in society.
So to sum up third wave feminism, they're more interested in a lot of relationships rather than just thinking about white middle-class women.
Yes, so they're thinking about women as a broader category. But they're also not just thinking about women. They're also interested in how gender norms in society are affecting men. Previously, and even still to some extent today, if you say gender to someone, they automatically assume you're talking about women. But men have gender too. And third wave feminists are starting to ask, how does having a gender affect men? How is the way their gender norms are socially constructed affecting the way they exist in society? And are these potentially very negative? So for example, the idea that men shouldn't express their emotions and telling a boy that he should act like a man. Well, what exactly does that mean? And there's increasing evidence that this can lead to serious mental health issues in men. So these are the sorts of things that third wave feminists are starting to draw attention to.
Okay, yeah, I remember studying this when I was an undergraduate. And I remember talking in one of my classes where we studied El Salvador about shifts in labor. And there were far more women who were able to become employed in the maquiladoras, which are the factories that assemble clothing. And with women getting work as the primary breadwinners, it left men outside of their traditional gender roles. And that created all sorts of problems.
Yes, and like I said, these are the sorts of things that third wave feminists are beginning to analyze. So looking at men as gendered subjects rather than as a default category that somehow exists without gender. Fourth wave feminism, which kicks off in the 2010s and is still the wave that we're in now, recommits to this idea of intersectionality. So they buy into this again and say, yes, this is really important to us and we want to keep talking about these things. They then push beyond the idea of looking at men as gendered subjects and instead want to completely break down gender norms entirely. They say that we don't need to have masculinity and femininity as separate categories. Gender is a spectrum, it's a continuum, and you can have any trait you want anywhere along that spectrum. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female.
Okay, so you're telling me about how folks are changing the way that they think about gender and approach problems related to gender. But what exactly does this have to do with criminology?
So essentially, in terms of connecting this to criminology, what it does is it changes the question. So going from why do women commit so little crime to why do men commit so much? Earlier theories that present men as the norm, this is now saying, okay, men are not a default category, they are a gendered group, and we need to look at them as that. So how does their gender affect their engagement with crime? Raewyn Connell, who is an Australian sociologist, and James Messerschmidt, who is an American sociologist, start to look at this issue of Masculinity and Crime. Over the period of the 90s to the early 2000s, they both published individually and then also together to build this idea of hegemonic masculinity. So similar to what we said about appropriate femininity, hegemonic masculinity is the dominant way of being male. It's the ideal male characteristic. And this includes things like toughness, physical power, authority, heterosexuality, and competitiveness. What Connell and Messerschmitt argue is that if a man fails to achieve a certain goal, he may choose to reaffirm his masculinity and redemonstrate his masculinity by engaging in some sort of deviant behavior. So whereas appropriate femininity encourages women to conform and dissuades them from committing crime, at least ideally, hegemonic masculinity actually promotes deviancy as a way to express masculinity.
So this is kind of like manly enemy theory.
Yes, exactly. So it's the idea that goals have been diverted and you need to reassert your masculinity again and do this through deviant means. Ideas about men as gendered subjects in their relation to crime are still in their early stages. They're still developing. We have a lot more theories about women as gendered subjects and crime than we do about men. But it's an area that's really rich for development and could cause some very revolutionary changes in criminology.
And I guess on the same token, we still don't know a whole lot about transgender people and other folks who identify on the spectrum of gender that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So queer criminology is another area that is connected to this and is in the beginnings of its development as a discipline.
All right, it sounds like that feminist criminology has shed a lot of light on issues that were previously ignored. Are there any critiques of it?
Yes, there are. And one of the key concerns, and this is shared by feminist criminologists themselves, is that it hasn't been as effective or impactful as they would like it to be. And part of the issue with this is that feminist criminology is not one big, grand, unifying theory. It's an umbrella term for a subdiscipline that includes a lot of theories. And within feminist criminology, there's a lot of debate about which theories are accurate, what they mean, what's the best way to talk about female offenders and female victims. Another issue, and this contributes to the difficulty of developing a grand unifying theory, is that as a theoretical approach, feminist criminology is focused on deconstructing categories. So you go from a situation where you're talking about women, which is a nice, juicy, analytical category, and then you come in with intersectionality, and you take that category and you break it up into a million little bits. That's great for developing nuance, but it's really tricky for developing a huge theory that explains all crime. And without this big theory, it's hard to have an impact in criminology more broadly. So it's the idea that feminist criminology is doing a lot of good work, but it's doing a lot of good work on the side and not necessarily having a big impact. Another concern that's connected to this is the idea that studying female criminals in isolation is just contributing to their marginalization. So one of the things that feminist criminologists are trying to fight against, they're actually just perpetuating. In general, criminology is still a male-dominated field, and the criminal justice system is still deeply sexist and patriarchal. And to be honest, the way that the broader society views female offenders hasn't changed hugely in the last 100 years. It's still the idea that they're either bad, crazy, or victims.
So those are exactly the kinds of terms that Cesare Lombroso was using back over 100 years ago. If that's the case, nothing's really changed. What has feminist criminology actually achieved?
So it's true that there hasn't been the kind of big significant change that feminist criminologists would want. But what's important is that they have drawn attention to women's experiences as both victims and offenders. And they've challenged the sexist theories that predated feminist criminology. They've also revealed many of the structural inequalities that exist in the criminal justice system, not just between men and women, but for other minority groups as well. They've revealed the criminal justice system to be a patriarchal institution that plays a key role in victimizing people. And that's something that, now that we're aware of it, we can take steps to address and hopefully enact some real change. Perhaps what's most important, though, is that it's drawn attention to issues of domestic violence and sexual violence. And as a result, we're starting to move towards better policing practices and better treatment for victims of those offenses.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for telling us about feminist criminology. It's certainly clear that it's a theoretical lens that is able to shine a light on so many different nuances that with the tools that we've learned about already, there just really isn't that capacity. We'll see you next time.